Oh, well, hello there. Hi. Today, we're going to read a book called Flora and Ulysses. It's about a girl and a squirrel. It's written by Kate DiCamillo. You might know Kate DiCamillo. She wrote other books like Because of Winn-Dixie, The Tale of Despereaux, one of my favorites, The Tiger Rising, my absolute favorite, The Magician's Elephant. Oh, all great books. So, we're going to read a little bit today, and let's get started. In the Tickman kitchen, late on a Sunday afternoon, he says, "Happy birthday to you," she said. "What is this, Donald?" He said, "This is your present. It's a Ulysses Super Suction Multi-Terrain 2000X. Happy birthday!" It's a vacuum cleaner. It's a Ulysses 2000X. Yep, it's the crown jewel of vacuums. It features an extra long cord so that absolutely no mess, no dirt is ever out of your reach. It's indoor, outdoor, it goes everywhere. It does everything. "Goody," she said. "You have to try it out. Turn it on. For heaven's sakes, Donald, please." Whoa, hey now. Uh-oh. It's vacuuming up all the stuff in the house. "What in the world, Donald? It's multi-terrain. You should try it outside." Woo! And that's how it all began. With a vacuum cleaner. Really. Chapter 1. A natural-born cynic. Flora Belle Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother, and she was also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incontesto. "Flora," her mother shouted, "what are you doing up there?" "I'm reading," Flora shouted back. "Remember the contract," her mother shouted. "Do not forget the contract." At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora had made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would, quote, work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and toward the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract, and they were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer, and she was divorced, and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. "I hate romance," said Flora out loud to herself. And she liked the way that sounded. She imagined them floating above her head in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head. "I hate romance." Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected this was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. "Yep," thought Flora, "that's me." She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing Incontesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickham's backyard. "What in the heck?" said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickman running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. Well, that can't be, thought Flora. Who vacuums their yard? Actually, it didn't look like Miss Tickham knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge. And the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. "A few bolts shy of a load," said Flora out loud. And then she saw that Miss Tickman and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. "Hey now," said Flora, and she banged on the window. "Watch out," she shouted. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." And she said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." There's just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever thought you would say, "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel"? It didn't make any difference, though, what words she had said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. "This malfeasance must Be stopped, said Flora in her deep and superheroic voice. This malfeasance must be stopped, was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing Incandesto and became the towering, crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper was not present. Look out, squirrel. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Foomp! Holy bagumba, said Flora. Chapter 2. The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought: food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this: I wonder what there is to eat. This thought is then repeated with small variations. For example, where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food? Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day, of course. All of this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickman's backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, here at last is my fate come to meet me. He did not think, oh please, give me one more chance and I will be good. What he thought was, man, I sure am hungry. And then there was a terrible roar and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in the squirrel's head, not even thoughts of food. Excuse me. Chapter 3. The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly, swallowing a squirrel was a bit much for even the powerful, indomitable, indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Miss Tickham's birthday machine let out an incredible roar and stuttered to a stop. Miss Tickham bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. For heaven's sakes, said Miss Tickham, what next? She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. Help, she said. I think I've killed a squirrel. Chapter 4. A Surprising Helpful Cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I'm a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mother called her. She said, where are you going, Flora Belle? Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Flora Belle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickman's in a single bound. Move out of the way, said Flora, and she gave Miss Tickham a shove and grabbed hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and shook it. Nothing happened. She shook harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur. Vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered. His chest rose and fell, rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt, and she put a finger on the squirrel's chest. Oh, no. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled, Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable things would happen next? Terrible things can happen to you, detailed the action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happened more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on the elderly, like your Aunt Edith if she choked on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What do you do if you were wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descended? Run. Locusts eat stripes. And of course, how to administer everyone's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible things can happen to you did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. I'll figure it out, said Flora. What will you figure out, said Miss Tickman. Flora didn't answer. Instead, she bent down and put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. Tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel. Fuzzy, damp, slightly nutty. Have you lost your mind? Said Miss Dickman. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth. She pushed down on his small chest. She started to count. Chapter 5. The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone black and blank. And then, into the blankness, there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. What's that? Said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. Okay, said the squirrel, you bet. He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. The squirrel heard another voice, and this voice was counting, and the light receded. Breathe, the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. Chapter 6. In the event of a seizure. Well, he's breathing, said Miss Dickman. Whew, yes, said Flora, he is. She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. He raised his head. His eyes were glazed. Well, for heaven's sake, said Miss Dickman, look at him. She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. And she kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you, advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilize it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason she couldn't save Miss Dickman's tongue. The sun sank a little lower in the sky, and Miss Dickman continued to laugh hysterically. And Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickman's backyard for a stick. Chapter 7. The Soul of a Squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't even known existed, had suddenly been flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel, and he was hungry. Very. That's a vacuum cleaner. What's that vacuum cleaner? I wonder if there's anything under that vacuum cleaner. Holy cow, he picked it up. Look at all the stuff under there. There's crackers. Wait, the squirrel picked up the vacuum cleaner? What? I can say what astonishments. Who can say what astonishments are hidden inside the most mundane beings? Wow. Something happened to that squirrel. Let's find out what happened next.